Hi everybody, and thank you for joining me on another episode of Gaffer and Gear. In today's episode, I'm finally doing the review for the Aputure XT26. This is Aputure's most powerful light to date. So this is a COB light. It's bicolor with green and magenta correction. It has a CCT range from 2700 Kelvin all the way up to 6,500 Kelvin. Now what sets this apart from other lights is it has the best dimming characteristics I've ever seen on a light. So this is manually dimming over 8-bit CRMX, and it smoothly dims all the way down to 0% brightness. Now just to show it off, this is at 1% brightness, and this is a sweep of the entire CCT range. And just to show off a little bit more, this is the light now fading to black from 1%. In this episode, we're also going to go over all of the accessories. I've got the Spotlight Max here with its 50-degree lens. I've got the 19-degree lens and the 36-degree lens. We're also going to have a look at the F14 motorized Fresnel, and we've got all of the Hyper Reflectors. We've got the narrow, the medium, and the wide. Now there's quite a lot of things to cover in this episode, so this episode is chaptered and indexed, so you can skip to the sections that you want to watch. Okay, so first thing I want to point out is as soon as you buy one of these, I would highly recommend firmware updating it. So that's the reason this episode is really late. The firmware has been bad and some of the firmware has been even worse. So definitely firmware update it. Now, just in case you were looking to buy one of these lights and you had one on a demo and it had the older version of the firmware, I just want to go over things that they've fixed because it really has undergone the equivalent of a brain transplant in the last 3 months. All right, so the first thing that was terrible was the recognition system. The programming was really poor on it. For example, if you're running it like this and then decide to put the barn doors on, you got a 600-degree Kelvin shift, and you also had your green magenta white point change. Now, this is programmed super accurate. Unless you've got a spectrometer, you won't be able to spot the difference between any of the modifiers. The programming is really tight. The next thing they've improved is the white placement. So it now tracks on the daylight curve in the daylight kelvins. So for example here on my hand, one side is lit with the XT26 and the other side is lit with sunlight, and you can't distinguish. That's how it should have been in the first firmware. And the last thing they've improved, this unit has 2 dimmer modes. It has a high-speed mode, which is constant current, and it has a pulse width modulation accurate dimming mode. Now with the pulse width modulation mode in the earlier firmwares, this is easily the worst light I'd ever reviewed in terms of getting flicker with high frame rates. Now it is the most flicker-free pulse width modulation light that I've ever come across. So what have they changed? Well, this thing now works at 125 kilohertz. So what that means is the light is pulsing 125,000 times a second. So even in its low speed filming mode or its accurate filming mode, this thing should now be flicker free to about 50,000 frames per second. Now in this photo here, the light is running at 0.1%, and this photo is taken with a 17,000th of a second shutter, and there is absolutely no flicker. Okay, now let's go through the cons and get those out of the way. Now I'm deliberately using the camera microphone and not my lapel microphone for this segment, so you get a fair and reasonable idea of the noise of this light. It is easily the loudest light that's ever come in here for review. Now at the moment it's running in its smart mode, and in the smart mode the pitch of the fans does vary quite a bit, even if you've got consistent temperature in the room that you're in. So I'd be a bit worried about using it in this smart mode anywhere near a microphone. So let's put it into its medium mode now. So this is the lowest that the fans run constantly. So I would be definitely concerned about that if I was anywhere near a microphone. Now to give you some idea of how loud they can get, I'm going to go to the full fan mode now. Now in all fairness, I've been testing this system for about 3 months. It has never got to full speed. So I think the full speed is just if you need to get heat out of the lights in a hurry. All right, so let's have a listen to full speed. Okay, let's go back to the smart mode. So I know what a lot of you are thinking, right? This is a high-powered light, you're just going to use it outside through a window. If that's the case, that's fine, you don't need to worry about it. But if you are thinking about possibly using this with, say, a 5-foot octadome for an interview situation where you've got a cityscape in the background and you can't ND the windows, you definitely wouldn't be able to use this. It would be way too loud. Okay, the next possible negative for people will be the size and weight of the controller. The controller comes in at 20.5 kilograms. It is literally so heavy, it has its own trolley. So this controller can do some amazing things. I mean, this light dims better than any other light I've come across. Tungsten, HMI, LED, fluorescent, whatever. This is the best dimming light. But you know what? That is completely academic for me because I can't fit this in my van. It's a real shame. So this is probably going to be a big negative for a lot of people. Now, the next possible negative to be aware of, particularly if you're an owner-operator like me and you're just working out of a garage or maybe your home, is that the whole system is sold to you in one box. And just let me tell you, that is incredibly difficult to get out of a delivery van if you don't have a forklift. Now, the next possible negative is something that the engineers are already working on, and it can be fixed in the firmware, but it is something that is very complex to do, so it won't get fixed anytime soon. So what have I found? If you're doing a CCT queue, so let's say the light is at 5,600 Kelvin and you want to do a transition to 3,200 Kelvin, if that queue is shorter than 3 seconds, the light will skew magenta halfway through the queue. Now this is very noticeable in my DMX testing because I've got it up against another light, so you can do a direct comparison. And in other segments of this review, I've deliberately done CCT queues so you can see that it's actually quite difficult to spot. Okay, so let's go through the pros now and explain at the same time why this controller is so incredibly huge. Okay, number one, it has 2 separate power supplies in it. So one power supply is calibrated for your top end and the other power supply is calibrated for your bottom end, which is how Aputure achieves such a smooth dimming across the entire range. So for example, 2% and below, you can do smooth fades up and fade down. So no other light I've come across can do that as well as this light can. Now, in addition to getting that smooth dimming, you also get incredibly high power factor unity scores. Even if the light is dimmed down to 50%, it still comes in with a 9.5. So what's the significance of that? Well, if you're running hundreds of these dimmed, you're not going to melt your neutral connectors. You're not going to throw any interference back down the neutral line and cause problems with the power supply coming into the studio, or cause power supply issues in the local suburb by blowing up a transformer. Now, in addition to that, if you were going to run, say, 4 of these off a 7 kVA generator and run them at 50% brightness, the generator won't have a problem with it. Whereas if you were using other brands at a similar wattage, running at 50% that don't have high power factor unity scores, the inverter in the generator could overheat and shut down after about an hour. Now, another reason this controller is so big is it has 2 separate dimming systems. It has its pulse width modulation dimming system, which is flicker free now to roughly about 50,000 frames per second, so you could use it for high speed filming. Now, this pulse width modulation system gives you very accurate CCTs as you dim. Now, should you need to shoot at super insane high speed rates, it also has a high speed mode. This uses a potentiometer dimming system or a constant current dimming system. So no matter what frame rate you're shooting at, it will be flicker free. But there is a trade-off. You can't dim below 20%, and with the current firmware, you can't operate in this mode with DMX. Now, the other reason this is so large is because everything is modular. If something inside breaks down, it's in a separate module that can be replaced. That's going to reduce the cost of repairs and also speed up repairs. In fact, even all of the connectors are separate modules. So if somebody yanks a cable out, they're not going to damage the circuit board underneath. And the same thing applies to the head. The reason the head is a little bit bigger than you might be anticipating and a fraction heavier is this is modular as well. Now, the last major pro for me is the build quality. With the exception of the glass over the COB and the user interface, these things are built like tanks. It would take a serious amount of effort to do any damage to these. All right, so a lot of you just want to know how bright is this with the different modifiers. So here's a quick compilation of the results at 5,600 Kelvin at a distance of 3 meters. Now, as you can see from the figures here, when it comes to maximum output, the reflectors are always going to be the kings, especially when it comes to narrow beams or spotted up. Now, something to note here is if you're going to use the Spotlight Max with its 50-degree lens, you would actually get more light level if the light had no modifier attached at all. Now, when it comes to brightness, the next thing you're going to ask me is which light is brighter, the XT26 or the Nanlux Evoke 2400B? Well, they're both brighter than each other. The Evoke is brighter in the lower kelvins and the XT26 is brighter in the daylight kelvins. Now, the next thing people have asked me is the Evoke brighter with its reflector on than the XT26 with its reflector? And people suspect this because the Nanlux has this massive, huge reflector with a large pickup area. Now, this isn't a straightforward question to answer because the XT26 is sold with a medium reflector, which is 35 degrees, and the Evoke is sold with a 45-degree reflector. So here's what I've done. I've decided to do a comparison using the wide reflector, which is 50 degrees. So this is 50 degrees and this is 45 degrees. Let's take a look. Now, in the lower kelvins, the Evoke 2400B is delivering way more light level, and this can't just be contributed to beam angle. However, in the higher kelvins, there isn't much difference at all between the two lights. The Evoke is still in front, but I would put this difference down to the beam angle. Okay, let's talk about how much this thing costs and what you get for your money. So we're talking about the basic kit here. There is a more expensive kit that comes with a road case. All right, so this sells for $8,000 US, and that's about 13,750 Monopoly dollars if you live in Australia. Okay, so for that money, you get a removable stirrup or yoke. Now, the removable stirrup or yoke has these clipping points here. That's your strain relief for your head lead cable, which is a very nice addition. Now, the light itself is very well built. So the light weighs in at 18 kilograms. That's minus the weight of the stirrup. Now, absolutely built solid. On the front of the unit, you have a Bowen mount and you have the A mount, the Aputure mount, which has a recognition system. This thing really, I can't say it enough, it really is built solid. It's got plenty of rigging points. You've got 4 rigging points at the top for your safeties, as well as the handle you could rig by. On the sides, you've got threaded mounts, and even on the bottom of the unit, you could use the feet as rigging points. Now, the one thing I really like about the yoke system is it's auto locking, so I don't have to unlock it to get the light onto the stirrup. Once it drops into place, it automatically locks solid. Now, one thing to point out here is the cap also has a recognition system, so if you do try to fire it up with the cap on, it won't turn on. Now let's talk about the cables to get those out of the way. It comes with a 15-meter head lead. That's 15 meters, not 15 foot. 15 meters is currently the maximum distance you can run from the controller to the head. So possibly not long enough for you guys who use the Condors. All right, now the cables do have their strain relief built on, so that's fantastic. And it does have a twist lock connector, similar to your HMI head leads, but unlike your HMIs, the sockets and plugs are welded to the cables so they can't be twisted and damaged. Now you also get your power cable, which has whatever socket this is, and at the other end you've got your regional connector. Now in Australia, this comes with a 20 amp plug top. So the thing to bear in mind with this is all of the power comes through the plug top. So all of the accessories that can clip on, like the motorized Fresnel and also the motorized pan and tilt yoke, that is also powered through here. So it must draw more than 15 amps in total. Although this doesn't draw anywhere near 15 amps by itself. Now, one thing to point out in terms of if you're looking to run this in Australia off domestic power outlets, which are 10 amps to 30 volts, if you run this thing in constant output, not maximum output, it will easily run off a 10 amp power circuit. Next up, you get a set of barn doors, and the barn doors are 8-leaf. And the barn doors also have a black dish, which has a recognition system. So you could use this with the bare COB for nice crisp shadows, and you've also got some control over the spill of the light. Also in the kit is the medium Hyper Reflector. This has a very strong external shell with rigging points. Now, if you drop this, the external shell is more than capable of protecting the inside dish. On the front of the Hyper Reflector, you've got an accessory slot which will fit the supplied barn doors. Now, one thing I almost forgot to mention is on the stirrup, you've got double disc lock-offs, so the light is going to stay where you point it. The next thing in the kit is a fold-out trolley. So this is for the controller. The controller weighs 20.5 kilograms, so quite heavy. Now, this has a big locking mechanism here, so once you drop the controller into place, it won't dislodge from the trolley until you press the release button. And last but not least, you get the controller. This is heavy. All right, so definitely you're going to want the trolley. The controller has a very simple and easy to use color user interface. On the data side of the controller, you've got 2 local area networks, DMX in and DMX out, and a USB port. On the power input side, you've got 2 DC inlets for battery operation, as well as an AC power inlet. Now let's have a look at how this light performs with no modifiers attached. And as you would expect, it has a very wide, very even beam angle. Now the light frosting on the glass that's covering the COB area seems to do a very good job of removing any gremlins from the edge of the beam. Regardless of the CCT, I can't see anything here that's going to be an issue. And the shadows are nice and sharp. As you can see here, this definitely delivers a very wide, even beam. And for those of you who are wondering how I managed to get stars exposed here, that's actually reflections coming off leaves in a tree that the camera is under. Now let's have a look with the barn doors. And with this incredibly wide beam angle, the barn doors can't cut all of it. However, the barn doors are very good if you want to box the beam up. Now let's see how the light performs through a window at a distance of 6 meters. And as you would expect from a singular small light source, we have very crisp shadows, regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Now let's have a look at the supplied 35-degree reflector. Now when you have a look at the brightness readings here, bear in mind that even though this is the supplied reflector, it is only 35 degrees. However, for a 35-degree reflector, it supplies quite an even beam. At a distance of about 3 meters, the shadows are pretty ordinary. But at a distance of 10 meters, the shadows are better than anything I ever got off an M series HMI. When we have a look at it outside lighting up a large area, you can definitely see the limitations of the 35-degree beam, but it is very even inside that 35 degrees. Now let's have a look at it with the supplied barn doors attached, and they don't really do a good job of giving you any fine control. They do help you box up the beam a little bit, and it might help with some spill light or some lens flare. Now let's see how the supplied reflector goes when put through a window at a distance of 6 meters. Now the 35-degree reflector definitely delivers some punch. Now it's definitely not delivering the sharpest shadows, but they're reasonable, at least when compared to something like you get off an M18 or an M40. And regardless of the CCT you dial in, the shadow characteristics seem to remain largely unchanged. Now let's take a look at the optional wide reflector, which is 50 degrees. This has a very even and very uniformed beam spread. At a distance of 3 meters, the shadows still look like they're coming off a faceted reflector. But at a distance of 10 meters, the shadows are razor sharp. As you can see, this reflector does a great job of lighting a large area. And teamed up with the barn doors, it offers you some control, but don't expect any fantastic cuts. Now let's see how it performs through a window at a distance of 6 meters. And it has pretty decent shadows. Now let's have a look at how the light performs with the 20-degree narrow reflector. Now this combination does have a bit of an obvious hotspot. And the results seem to be the same regardless of the CCT dialed in. At a distance of 3 meters, the shadows are very alien. And at a distance of 10 meters, there is some obvious double shadowing. Using it to light a large area at a distance, this thing does supply quite a bit of firepower, and the hotspot isn't as noticeable. Now let's have a look at it as sunlight through a window at a distance of about 6 meters. The shadows are a little bit soft, but there's no denying the firepower. Okay, let's have a look at the F14 Fresnel, and this thing is quite big, but it is motorized. So let's talk about the motorization first. So if you want to operate it manually, you've got a display on the side that tells you what beam angle you're at, and you twist the knob to flood and spot. So it is a little bit of a slow process doing this. Now the other way you can operate this, if you can't be up where the head is you can operate it from the controller. So you don't need to climb up on a ladder to do all your flood spotting. You can also operate it over the phone app, and of course you can operate it over DMX and CRMX. So it has a separate channel assigned for the flood spot, as you would expect it would. So let's talk about what it is about this flood spot mechanism, or not so much the mechanism, the programming that I really hate. So what's my issue with the firmware for this Fresnel? And hopefully it is just a firmware issue and they can fix it. Well, it's to do with how it calibrates. Every other motorized Fresnel I've ever used, when it receives power, when you turn it on, it will do a calibration. So they will go to their flood position, go to their spot position, and then go back to where they were. So it does that in order to know where the start and end of the carriage is, when to turn the motors on and off, and where it is in position in relation to the flood spot beam angle. This Fresnel does not do that. When you turn it on, it does not auto-calibrate. Now, you can manually calibrate this anytime you want by holding the button down for 5 seconds. So in order to get around calibration issues, what I've been doing when I use this unit is, when I set it up, first thing I do is a calibration. Okay, that'll get me through the day. If you don't do a calibration, what I've found is later on in the afternoon, it might go out of calibration. Now, I've done testing here in the workshop where I've just had this set up, and I've come in every couple of hours and sent a DMX command through to see if it flood spots. And what I've found is it will need a calibration every day and a half to 2 days. Okay, if you don't calibrate it, what happens is the flood spot mechanism will stop working. The numbers might change, but it actually doesn't flood spot. And the controller comes up with an error code telling you that you need to press the button to recalibrate it. Okay, so big deal. Every day and a half to 2 days, I might have to press a button. Who cares? That's not the end of the world. It's not a difficult task to do. Well, yes, it can be a difficult task. What if this is in a lighting grid in a studio for a week-long shoot? Well, that's going to be a bit of a pain. What if you've got it in a condor and it decides it doesn't want a flood spot? Then you've got to lower the whole condor down just to press this button. And from a logical point of view, from rentals, let's say I rent this out to somebody and it decides it doesn't want a flood spot anymore. What's that person going to do to try and resolve the issue? They're going to turn the light off and on and see if that fixes the problem. And if it self-calibrates at that point, it would fix the issue. Now, my next issue is also firmware related. Hopefully it can be fixed. And that is when you turn it off. All right, so at the moment it's at 50 degrees maximum flood. Let's power it down. Now, when you power it down, you can hear the mechanism moving around inside. This is where this is genius. So what it's doing is it's moving all of the optics back here so that the unit is now balanced. Okay, so I'm going to undo the lockers. And as you can see, perfectly balanced. Okay, so if you're going to take it off the stand, it's not going to be front heavy or back heavy if you've got a couple of people helping you to pack this up fully assembled. That really is clever. I really do like that. But here's the issue. Let's turn it back on. I mean, maybe we just went to lunch and we powered it down and now we're coming back from lunch. Power it up. It doesn't return to its previous setting. Even over DMX, over the phone app, it won't go to its previous setting. You have to enter in a new value in order to go back. The Fresnel is IP65 rated, so you can use it outside in a storm, and it comes in at 16.9 kilograms. Now, it is sold in this massive road case, so that is something to be aware of. Now, it is sold with the barn doors and also a set of skids. So if you're one of those gaffers that really loves your Fresnels and you figure you're only going to use this with the Fresnel attached, well, you can mount the skids to the bottom here and store the whole thing assembled in your truck. But here's the catch. If you've got the skids attached, you can't take the light off the back. Now, this Fresnel has a beautiful wide even beam with a gentle drop off, like you would expect from the old school large lens Fresnels. But note, unlike other daylight Fresnels, there doesn't seem to be any colour skewing towards the edge of the beam. The results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Now let's have a look with it spotted up. And this is the fastest that you can spot it. Now, despite the multi-leaf barn doors, you can't get a cut across the entirety of the beam. And it does box up rather well. These are the shadows at a distance of 3 meters and at 10 meters. Now, just like with the wide angle reflector, this does a good job of lighting up a large area, with two notable advantages. The first being that you can flood spot, and the second being barn door control. Now let's have a look at this playing as sunlight through a window at a distance of 6 meters. And as you can see in flood, it does have nice shadows. As I spot it up, you can see the brightness increase and the shadow sharpness decrease. Now let's have a look at a CCT sweep. And now I'm going to flood it so you can compare the shadow qualities. Okay, now let's have a look at the XT26 through the Spotlight Max with the different lenses. Now the first thing people have asked me is, does this get hot? Well, this section here would be ideal for cooking eggs, bacon and fingers. Now the one thing that does get incredibly hot is the gobos. So not only would I be concerned about burning myself on these, even if you're wearing gloves, you need to think about where you're going to put the gobo down so you don't accidentally burn a surface. Now this gets hot to the point that I would recommend having a second gobo holder, particularly if you need to audition or change your gobos in a hurry. Now bear in mind with these that the gobos are held in with pressure. So you have to press against this point here and then push up against the gobo to release it. So that means you're pressing onto super hot metal. In terms of the rest of the unit, from the accessory slots out, the barrel is reasonably cool and I have no problems operating it barehanded, even if it's been running for several hours. And the cutter blades here, they're beautifully insulated, so you're definitely not going to burn yourself on these. Now one thing to note is that the Spotlight Max attaches to the light via the inside bow and mount ring, not the outside A-mount ring here. So what that means is that the sensor pins here are not detecting that it has the Spotlight Max. So when you dial in your CCT target values, they won't be correct. Now the dual locking mechanism can easily hold the weight of the XT2600. So let's completely undo this side, and it's now being held in place with the locker on this side, no problem at all. But if you do undo that second locker, just be ready to catch the weight because it is very back heavy. As an optional extra, you can also purchase an ETC lens adapter, but I don't have any ETC lenses to show this off. Okay, let's start off by looking at the 50-degree lens. Now, just to note, this attaches to the Bowen mount, which doesn't have the recognition system. So I had to have it running at its maximum Kelvin of 6,500 to get close to 5,600. It really is amazing how evenly illuminated this beam is. Now it does have a bit of chromatic aberration right on the edge of the beam, but if you're in a wide shot like this, I don't think you're ever going to see it. But just to note, look at the brightness levels. This doesn't give you much light at all. Despite having some very good cuts, it does have a fair bit of light in the shadowed areas. I'm lining up the cuts here with the straight lines on my garage doors, so you can get a gauge of how much concaving or convexing there is. Now the barrel doesn't rotate, so this is as angled a slash as you can generate. Now this unit can focus and defocus without any color emitters showing up. And the results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Gobo projections have a massive range of focus and defocus. And you can rotate the gobos in the holder. But note here, I can't get the entire gobo in focus. But as you'll see later, if you're throwing a long distance, everything's in focus. Now I'm running it with a gobo inside, doing blade cuts, and I have the iris attached. And as you can see, everything is on a very different focus plane. This is the focus point for the iris, and this is the focus point for the gobo. Now the shadows are quite sharp at a distance, but if you get in close, you can see there's some chromatic aberration. And if you expose into the shadows, you can see the gobo pattern. And also you can see a ring reflecting off the gobo holder. Now, if you're shooting outside at night and you want a 50-degree beam that is perfectly evenly lit, this would take some beating. And you've got some real control over your lighting. Now, at this distance, you can see that a gobo projection across the entire house is in focus. Now let's combine gobo projections and cuts and see if this could be a handy combination on a night exterior. Now I'm just going through the focus range to show the possibilities. Now let's have a look at the 50-degree lens going through a window. And I've deliberately got the light low to the ground to show you a trick I use if I can't get the sunlight up high. Now, as you would expect, we've got incredibly sharp shadows, but sunlight wouldn't come in at an angle like this. However, with a projection mount, you can change the top cut and make it look like the sun is coming in from a different angle. Just bear in mind that if an actor walks into this light, they're going to throw a shadow on the background and it could destroy the gag if you're also running a gobo pattern. Now, there really isn't enough light here to sell this as daylight, but it could be handy for a moonlight effect. Now let's take a look with the 36-degree lens. And again, because this is running through the Bowens mount, it is not connected to the recognition system. So I found in order to get close to 5600 Kelvin, you have to dial in 6350. This has a very even beam, but there is quite a bit of light haloing around the edges. Now, other people I've spoken to who have this lens don't have this problem, but I seem to have some condensation trapped in mine. The results are the same regardless of the CCT that I dial in. Now the blade cuts are nice and sharp, but there is a bit of ghosting into the shadows. And there is a little bit of concaving on your fine slashes. Now, because the barrel doesn't rotate, this is the maximum angle you can make with the cutter leaves. Gobo projections are sharper from edge to edge, and again you can rotate the gobos in the gobo holder. There is a massive amount of focus range available on gobos, and at no point do you see the light emitters. The gobo and the cutter blades can be used together, but they are on very different focal planes. Now let's have a look with the optional iris. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobos. And this is the focal plane for the cutter blades. Upon close inspection, you can see some chromatic aberration, but I don't think this would be an issue if you're running the gobos out of focus or they were at a distance in the background. If you expose into the shadow areas, you can see the rest of the gobo. And you can see a reflection of the gobo holder. Now let's try this out somewhere that's a bit bigger than my workshop. Blade cuts work beautifully over long distances, as does focusing and defocusing. If you're lighting something as large as a house, you can get even gobo focus from edge to edge. And here is the focus range. Even over long distances, there is no dangers of the emitters coming into focus. Now let's take a look at this through a window at a distance of about 6 meters. And once again, I deliberately have the light low to the ground. The shadows are razor sharp. We've got enough light level for this to be convincing as daylight, and we can also use the blades to effect. And the shadow qualities remain the same regardless of the color that you dial in. Now let's take a look at the 19-degree lens. And again, you have to dial in a way higher CCT value to get 5600 Kelvin. Now the results are pretty much the same. It's just the beam is tighter and the levels are brighter. Once again, there's no real difference in the characteristics depending on the CCT that you dial in. Blade cuts are still nice and sharp. You still have the same angle limitations with the blades. And you've still got the same massive focus and defocus range on your gobos. The optional iris still works really good. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo. And this is the focal plane for the blades. Upon close inspection, there is minimal chromatic aberration compared to the other lenses. If you expose into the shadows, you can still see the gobo and a circular reflection from the gobo holder. The one big difference between this and the other lenses is this seems to have way more ambient light around the edge of the beam. Now I don't really have access to somewhere big enough to show the throw of this beam. Even out the front of my house, it's a little bit ridiculous. Although it could come in handy for highlighting background elements in a wide shot. Now the 19-degree beam can actually light the average size window if the light's coming in at an angle. Because it's 19 degrees, we have quite a bit of light level here. The shadows are still really sharp and we can play with our edges. Now I forgot to mention in the other segments that you can defocus your cuts. Okay, let's start the DMX testing. The XT26 is receiving its commands via its internal CRMX receiver. It is running off an 8-bit profile, its dimmer is set to linear, and its smoothing will be turned on or off depending on the test we are doing. To give you something to compare it to, I have a SkyPanel S60C. Now this is not a brightness comparison. The SkyPanel S60C is substantially closer to the wall. The SkyPanel S60C is receiving its commands via an external CRMX receiver. It is also running an 8-bit CCT profile, and it also has its dimmer set to linear. Now despite this SkyPanel being the oldest light in my arsenal, I am keeping it for gaffer and gear reviews because it is still one of the best responding lights to CRMX commands. Both lights will be receiving their commands at the same time. I'm going to start off with instant on-off commands, and for this the XT26 will have its smoothing turned off. Now we will do the same test again, but this time the XT26 will have its smoothing turned on. Now let's take a look at some half-second cues, and for these the XT26 will have its smoothing turned off. Now the XT26 did shimmer there quite violently. This is more apparent by eye than it is on camera. Now let's continue the testing with the smoothing turned on. And now for some 1-second cues. Now for some 2.5-second cues. And now for some 5-second cues. Now let's have a look at some CCT changeovers between 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin, starting with instant CCT changes. For this first test, the XT26 will have its smoothing turned off. Now the same test again, but this time with the smoothing turned on. Now for a half-second changeover, and for this test the XT26 has its smoothing turned off. Now let's continue the testing with the smoothing turned on. Now let's have a look at some 1-second cues. Now let's have a look at some 2.5-second cues. And now for some 5-second cues. Okay, let's take a look at the AC power draw. Now these readings were taken with the fans running at full power and the light set to maximum output. Now please note, for those of you who are interested in the power factor unity scores, I couldn't take a reading above 80% because my power factor unity meter does not go above 2400 watt. But at 80% brightness, having a power factor unity score of 0.97 is really impressive. Now let's take a look at the dimming. This light has two dimmer modes, a potentiometer dimming mode, which is entirely flicker free, and a more accurate pulse width modulation dimming mode, which is what I've taken my readings with. This pulse width modulation dimming mode is running at 125 kilohertz. Now with the light set to 0.1% brightness, taking a photo at the highest shutter speed I possibly could, I got absolutely no flicker. Now let's take a look at the dimming characteristics at 3200 Kelvin in the pulse width modulation mode. I've taken readings at 100%, 75%, 50%, 25%, 10%, 5%, 1%, and 0.1%. Across the entire dimming range, the CCT is very close to the target value. The TM30 color render score does drop from a 95 to a 92, and between 100% to 1%, The delta UV, which is the white point or green magenta shift, does drift a little bit by roughly the equivalent of plus or minus 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. Now let's take a look at the characteristics at 5600 Kelvin. And there is some variation in the CCT. The color render does drop from a 94 to a 91, and there is a bit of deviation in the delta UV. The overall variation is a bit more than the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. Now let's have a look at the average CCT accuracy. Now I've taken readings at every CCT that you can dial into the light. And as you can see, the higher the CCT target value, the more inaccurate the light is. Now let's have a look at color render measured in TM30RF. The highest score is a 96, the lowest score is a 93, and across the bulk of its range, it's scoring a 94. Now let's have a look at the white point accuracy measured in delta UV. Between 2700 Kelvin to 3000 Kelvin, it is accurate to an average of plus or minus 0.0004. Between 3050 Kelvin to 4000 Kelvin, it is incredibly accurate with a delta UV average accuracy of plus or minus 0.0003. Now between 4000 Kelvin and 5000 Kelvin, the light leaves the Planckian curve and heads up towards the daylight curve, which is why I do not give it an average. Between 5000 Kelvin to 6000 Kelvin, it has an average delta UV of plus 0.0035, which has it tracking almost perfectly to the daylight curve. Now let's take a closer look at some of our kelvins, starting off with the lowest kelvin that we can dial in. When I dialed in 2700 Kelvin, I got 2712. The TM30 color render results were 96% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R9 is below 90. The spectrum distribution is very healthy, and the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0006. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3180 with an SSI score of 86. The TM30 color render results were 95% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and you can see the green emitter is being used to add depth. And the white point comes in with a delta UV of plus 0.0012, which does make the light slightly green at this point to roughly the equivalent of half of a 1/8 correction gel. Now it's a real shame that this happened at 3200 Kelvin, because from 3000 Kelvin up to 4000 Kelvin, this thing was accurate to usually about plus or minus 0.0003. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4494. The TM30 color render results were 94% average color accuracy with an average 102% color saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 and R12 are both below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution, and you can see it's not just a bicolor light. And the delta UV came in at plus 0.0020. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5830 with an SSI score of 75. The TM30 color testing results were 94% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and you can see they're using the green emitter to help fill it out. And the white point came in with a delta UV of 0.0034. So if your camera's working to the Planckian curve, that would make this light slightly green to a little bit more than the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. But if your camera's working to the daylight curve, then this is smack on. When I dialed in the top Kelvin of 6500, I got 6740. The TM30 color render results were 93% average color accuracy with an average 100% color saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the light is still tracking to the daylight curve with a delta UV of plus 0.0029. Alright, so just my closing thoughts. Careful what you ask for, because you might just get it. This is a light that is super powerful and can smoothly fade to black. You can operate this at 1 and 2%. You try doing that with any tungsten fixture. You can't do it. This thing can dim better than a tungsten light. But nobody told us that the trade-off was a 20.5 kilogram controller that is physically this big. So that's what I mean by careful what you ask for. You might just get it. Other manufacturers haven't done this because they know that that ballast is too big a trade-off for a lot of us. So this light and all of this stuff here represents the kit that I would love to have. but I can't physically fit this in either of my lighting vehicles. So it's a no from me, unfortunately, but on the plus side, Aputure gave me this light for free for the review and all of the accessories. Somebody out there is going to be getting a really good deal when I sell it to them.